Hello and welcome back to Gript. I'm your host Fatima Gunning, and today I'm joined in the studio by Anti-Euthanasia campaigner Alex Schadenberg. Alex, thank you for joining us firstly. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the area of campaigning against euthanasia?
And so I've actually been involved with this issue for now over 25 years, which is sort of a rarity, but I'm from Canada, and in Canada we started debating euthanasia in the 90s already, so that's quite a long time ago. Over 30 years ago we had a case in 1993 that went to our Supreme Court, and at that time the Supreme Court turned the woman down, said no, we will not allow for euthanasia. But anyway, I became someone who was doing a lot of work around that issue, especially since I have a son who's autistic and disabled, and we got involved with the whole autistic issue of being groups and things like that, and I realized really how this affects people with disabilities in a far different way than how we just say the average population, and that's what got me motivated.
And I suppose the way euthanasia is often discussed theoretically, it's kind of packaged as something compassionate that you do for somebody that's, near death anyway. But can you talk us through some of the real life cases in Canada where you're from?
It's interesting because you're right about how they package it, because I think that was a good comment that I should comment on first, is how they package it. They package it as the person who's suffering and near to death. And in Canada, we went through story after story after story of different people whose cases came forward and they went to the media, etc., before we legalized euthanasia. So they sort of, how would you say, they created the reason why people thought this would be a good idea. And the fact of it is when you actually look at the reality of the issue, this is not the reality of this. This is not just for people who are dying. This is not just for people who are suffering. But in Canada, they sold it. They sold euthanasia as for those very few cases. That's what they told people. They said, no, it's not going to be spreading. It's not going to be like the Netherlands. It's not going to be like Belgium. It's going to be for those very few cases of people who are nearing death and suffering. And most people thought that was reasonable. But in fact, that's not what's happened at all. What's happened is exactly, we've had many stories. And I should give you a bit of insight first, because I would say that if you legalize in Ireland, that's exactly the same thing that's going to happen. That it started with a law that required a terminal illness. Even though it wasn't really defined well, nonetheless, the law was written in such a way that it required someone with a terminal illness. And then in 2021, so we legalized in 2016. Less than 5 years later, we amended the law to remove the terminal illness requirement for the law. And then we also added in at the same time euthanasia for mental illness alone. Now we've held off on that one still, meaning that they put that in the law. It was passed, but they right now have, they've delayed that now until March of 2027. I don't want to get into all the politics of it, but I will say what's happened is that you have a situation where it's been sold for far greater reasons than anybody would ever thought people would ask for this for or approve this for, based on this whole concept of equality. The argument came as soon as we legalized it that in fact the law was discriminatory. The law denied then what we call, well, you and I would call it euthanasia, but they call it medical aid in dying. It denied medical aid in dying to people who weren't terminally ill, but might have a chronic condition, and that was a discrimination against them because they could also be suffering, right? And that's exactly it. It's the same reason why in 2021 we extended our law to include people with mental illness alone. They said that people with mental illness are also suffering, and I'm not going to argue that. People with mental illness are obviously suffering. So therefore it was a discrimination not to allow them to also have it. So this is the kind of thing we've had. The concept of keeping it tight is how they sell it. So a lot of people say, well, that seems reasonable, even though I may not like it, that seems reasonable. In the end, it always expands.
And can you talk about the real figures, like how many of the cases in Canada, to your knowledge, are people who are, terminally ill, suffering, elderly, and how many are the younger people who may have something that's, we hear stories of people being offered euthanasia when they need something like, something as simple as like help in the home. Like we've heard stories like that from Canada. What are the numbers showing?
So first of all, it's very interesting you talk about numbers, because the Canadian government is very slow in releasing the numbers. So you're actually talking to the person who's done a lot of research on that, and I've been able to get the numbers from the different provinces. So in Canada, healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, and our federal government has been releasing the data very slow. So I have contacted the individual provinces and released it and gained the data. So euthanasia has grown very, very fast in Canada, and that's, you alluded to that. In fact, the Netherlands had legalized euthanasia in 2001, and then the law came into place in January of 2002. So that's a long time ago, and I'm not saying there's anything wonderful about the Netherlands law because there's nothing good about it, but nonetheless, over that period of time, Canada has already caught up to their numbers, their percentage of deaths, and yet we legalized in 2016. So right off the bat, it's been normalized very fast in our country. Also Quebec. Quebec is the French province in Canada. They have the highest euthanasia rate in the world. But it's not only the numbers of deaths, it's also the types of deaths. Now, it's very hard, you asked me the question about numbers, it's very hard to actually break that down if you consider that the federal government actually hasn't released the numbers recently. They're actually really delayed in releasing the numbers. So it'd be very hard to actually look at it and break it down. But what we can tell you is quite a few stories that I've really, they almost seem ridiculous, what's been allowed. And yet, these are real stories that have been not only in the newspapers, but you've seen these cases hit the courts, etc. So we do see the deaths of people with disabilities, people in poverty, people who are homeless. We've seen these deaths occur. We've seen people being approved for many cases. So for instance, I'll give you an example. So by removing that terminal illness restriction for the law, what happened is that meant that the law now applied to people with what they call an irremediable medical condition, which would mean like a chronic condition. But it's not defined, and it's very difficult to then actually figure out what that actually means. But to some doctors who are really into euthanasia, it's pretty wide in how they interpret it. So we, for instance, had a case in Toronto of a 23-year-old young man who had insulin-dependent diabetes, and he was approved for euthanasia. And it was shocking to his mother. In fact, the W5 is like a major news sort of investigation show, and they did an interview with this young man. His name was Keanu, and his mother, Margaret. And you see, they took all that B-roll, and they show him he's on his skateboarding around and everything. He looks pretty good, but he was approved for euthanasia. So you get this crazy sort of thing like this. How did this happen? Because he had an irremediable medical condition. He has insulin-dependent diabetic, so therefore he qualified under the law. So his mother did prevent that death, but it wasn't the law that had any way to prevent it. What happened is that she was so upset that her otherwise healthy son, who was depressed, yes, he wanted to die, he was requesting to have his life ended, but she was shocked that they would actually have approved this. So she ended up going to the media, going to the government, but then she did a big petition, and we helped her with that petition, and she named the doctor who had agreed to kill her son. And then he changed his mind. He thought that was just a bit too much for him. But you get these cases. How did this doctor approve a 23-year-old young man who's actually reasonably good so long as he's, taking his insulin?
In terms of the public opinion towards euthanasia in Canada, has there been a lot of pushback against it, or is it like something that's seen as a foregone conclusion now?
Well, it's a very good question. Is there? So what's happened is, I just told you one story, and there's been many stories. I can go through some more of those. What's happened is that the more, how would you say, stories that have come up about these cases, we've actually seen this type of a political pushback. So when I mentioned earlier that in 2021 we expanded the law, and that included euthanasia for mental illness, but the government has delayed that now, the euthanasia for mental illness, that is, until March of 2027. That's actually directly related to the pushback in the culture to how euthanasia has expanded so quickly. So the government has had a lot of heat on this question. When you get people who are homeless being approved for euthanasia, how could you have done that? Like, this becomes then a social question, where originally it was seen as, oh, this is compassionate because these people are suffering, etc. But now it's a homeless question. Now it's a question about poverty. We had a food bank in Mississauga went to the media saying, we're very concerned because several of our recipients of help are seeking euthanasia.
The likes of which they've never seen. In the past 2 weeks alone, she's fielded 5 calls from clients seeking help in ending their own life.
So people are so desperate, they're coming here for food, but then they're asking you about assisted suicide?
Yes.
You're having people ask you about assisted suicide?
Yes. When I say that this is an emergency in the community, People who are living at the bottom income percentile in our community are talking to us now about taking their own lives because it's too hard to be poor any longer.
You start thinking about this. So you know that there's economic pressures going on, and you know there's a lot of people going through difficult times, but now because how the law has become and how doctors are interpreting this so widely, you have these people now dying by lethal injection. But you see, the general public actually has been reacting to that. So that's why the euthanasia for mental illness has been delayed, because the heat on the government was so extreme that they decided to, I would say, kick the can down the road. They didn't say we're not going to do that. They just said we're going to wait now until March of 2027 to allow euthanasia for mental illness. Now, I have to explain to your listeners or your watchers that in Canada, people can have euthanasia for mental illness, even though they can't have it for euthanasia for mental illness alone. So as of this moment, somebody who's experiencing a health condition, but the reason they're asking for it is that they're very depressed or experiencing some form of mental illness, etc., they can be approved for euthanasia because they have another condition. But they might be asking for it based on that, based on their mental health questions. So they can still die for euthanasia by mental illness if they have, another condition that's serious.
So if they were to have a physical impairment, they could use that to get the...
And it's exactly as you said. Like, for instance, because of how the law is defined, if someone were having a significant disability and then they also were going through some serious serious depression or mental health questions, they would be approved based on their disability, but they would maybe be asking for it based on their mental health questions. It's actually quite crazy what's happening. We had a recent case in Calgary, and I've been very connected to this case. 27-year-old woman with autism, and she had actually applied for euthanasia the previous year, and they turned her down because there's really technically nothing wrong with this woman. Yes, she's autistic, and yes, she was going through suicidal ideation. And I should maybe say something that a lot of people who are listening maybe not have clued into, but a lot of people go through suicidal ideation. It's not an uncommon thing. It's not a new thing to the human family. It's always been part of, a difficulty that people will experience at times in their life. But the difference is now that you've legalized euthanasia in our country, now they're actually being killed while experiencing suicidal ideation rather than receiving the help that they need. Anyway, she's 27, and she was scheduled to die on February the 1st, 2024, so it's this year. And her dad, and she was living with her parents. So it's not like she's living on her own, etc. She's living with her parents. Her dad was absolutely shocked. How could you have approved my daughter? There's nothing wrong with her. Well, as I say, she applied the first time and she was turned down because they said, and then she was advised, well, if you were suffering, we would have approved you. So then when she applied the second time, she told them she was suffering. So even in her application that she was approved for it, it said unknown cause of suffering. So if you think about it, it seems insane, but sadly it's true. And then what happened is the dad went to court, and he ended up having the judge say, well, I can't actually prevent your daughter's euthanasia death. There's nothing in the law that allows me to prevent it. But I'm very concerned with how this decision was made. So he opened up the question of how could this decision have been made? The dad then appealed the decision, and this young woman is still alive today. Even though she still wants euthanasia, sadly, no one's willing to do it at this moment. And it's all in sort of a holding factor. But the fact that he was willing to go to court and make a deal of it, and his argument, of course, was, how did my daughter get approved? This doesn't make any sense. She's living with us every day. How did you approve her? And this is the shocking thing. She would have been dead if he didn't go to court.
And what are some of the reasons? Like, the cases you've outlined make it look like there's, a flippancy towards signing these people off to be euthanized. Is that the case? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, it's not a flippancy. What it is that there's certain doctors who have become really, they really believe that there's a right to die. So they would think that if somebody asks them for this and they have therefore a condition which qualifies, they would argue that why should I stand in the way of their death? Now, of course, it's not like suicide because they're actually killing them. We're talking about euthanasia when the doctor actually does the act. The doctor is putting lethal poison into your system to kill you. So when you think about that, this is not just a simple case of, well, how can I stand in the way? You know, I can't even compare it to the issue of jumping off a bridge and people saying, well, I'm not going to prevent you from jumping off that bridge because, you know, who am I to stand in your way of killing yourself? This is not even that. This is more the doctor is then legally entitled to push you off the bridge. So some doctors are actually really into this. Some doctors in Canada now that this is pretty much all they do. There's several of them who have set up euthanasia clinics. There's a few retired doctors who've come back and this is their practice. They're not doing anything else but this. And so, you know, you get this different level of response to it. So most doctors wouldn't be very flippant about it, actually. Even ones who are pro-euthanasia would be quite careful with it. But there are the few who are quite flippant. So even when I'm talking about these cases, like when I'm referring to these cases, for instance, in British Columbia, there's 2 euthanasia clinics in British Columbia. Most of the cases that happen in British Columbia come from those 2 euthanasia clinics. So obviously, those doctors see this in a far wider way than even their pro-euthanasia friends do. So that's how it sort of is. The law was not designed to be interpreted tightly. The law in Canada, and language is everything in a law, the law says that the doctor or the nurse, because the nurse practitioners in Canada can also do it, the doctor or the nurse only has to be of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. The law says that you only have to have now, originally it said you had to have now it says you have to have an irremediable medical condition that you find grievous. Well, obviously you wouldn't be asking to die if you didn't find it grievous. But the point of it is that it's very loose in its language and it's being interpreted very widely by many, and that's how you get these cases. But how is it affected also, this is what really bothers me, and how it's affecting now people with disabilities in a major way. So last week there was a court case launch, and I'm talking about in October, there was a court case launched in Canada, just early October, late September, early October, by the disability community to stop the current law because they're saying how this has got such a negative effect upon people with disabilities. So 4 disability groups came together. So you get these cases where people are being pressured to ask for euthanasia. So in my own city of London, Ontario, there's Roger Foley, who was pressured by the hospital to ask for euthanasia. Roger Foley has cerebral ataxia, and it's developed to the point where he needs 24-hour care, and he's been pressured by the certain doctors, nurses, and the medical system that he should be dying by euthanasia. Well, Roger's got no interest in euthanasia. He's never asked for euthanasia, and yet they're being pushing it on him. You know, we had this Heather Hancock story. Heather is a woman who's very intelligent, an excellent writer. She actually has written several books. She does a lot of editing. That's how she makes her living on the side. She does editing, editing of books, editing of papers, things like that. She's very effective. She's very good. But a few years ago, when she was going through significant health problems, she was at a hospital, and she explains how before breakfast, so early in the morning, a nurse came into her room and said, you know, you should really be asking for medical aid in dying. So could you imagine that? You're sick, you're going through difficulties, and a nurse tells you, you should be asking for medical aid in dying. And the nurse said to her, if I were you, I would take it in a heartbeat, because she said, you're just existing, you're not even living, is what she was told. If you think about that kind of attitude in the culture, you start realizing how dangerous this has become, because if Heather weren't the strong personality she is, and going through a difficult time, she might have thought, well, maybe you're right.
I think, again, the way euthanasia can often be presented is that, you know, the patient, when they are cognizant, is the one that requests it because they want to end their own suffering. But from what you've been saying there, it sounds like in certain cases it's being pushed on people.
Yeah. So what's happened in Canada is that, and it's not much different than the Netherlands or Belgium, and if you legalize here in Ireland, it's probably going to move that same way. And the reason is that if it becomes a legal service, then doctors are being told, well, then it's an option. And so they're saying, well, you know, let's say you have cancer as an example, so the doctors are being told you have to offer everybody their options. So, you know, you have this type of cancer, so we have this treatment and this treatment, but we also have medical aid in dying, okay? But in the same way, certain people have a type of a eugenic attitude. So you get the type of, you know, a nurse who will say to Roger Foley that, you know, Roger, you really have 2 choices, you know? you can either pay the hospital X amount of dollars a day and stay here, or you can have euthanasia. You know, and he's like, I've not asked for this. I'm not interested in dying. Actually, I have no interest in dying. I've got interest in living. What I'd really like is I'd like home care. That's his response. I really like home care. If you read his story, you'll realize that the whole battle is over home care. He's been denied home care, okay? But anyway, the fact of it is that the attitude of the individual affects the issue directly. You also talked about, and I think it was a good point, we talked about this as if it's like sort of an autonomy question. But even if I ask for it, is it actually a true autonomy question when somebody else kills me? So we start thinking about the meaning of autonomy. It's an act I do to myself. Is euthanasia autonomy when somebody else is lethally injecting me with a poison? Well, obviously it's not, because now it's not an act I'm doing to myself. It's an act that someone else is doing to me. Even if I requested it, you can't divorce the act of the person who agreed that my life was not worth living and actually killed me. You can't separate them. And even if you say, oh, well, maybe we should just limit this to assisted suicide. Assisted suicide has the same philosophical problems, because you now, again, have a doctor directly involved with prescribing those lethal drugs that you would have to take yourself.
If I can come back to the case of Roger Foley, you said he was denied home assistance. Is that a case of, you know, resources being scarce or cost coming into play? What do you think is behind that decision?
You know, it's interesting you say, because I know Roger very well. He's in the same city as I, and I've met with him quite a few times, and we have quite a friendly relationship. And I have a huge amount of respect for Roger, but he needs 24-hour care. And he knows, and I know, and we all know that that's sort of expensive. The fact is that we have that program in my province where people receive 24-hour care. Now, in his case, he didn't just want home care, he wanted what they call self-directed care. And the reason is that when he was receiving home care, he was getting sick regularly because he had this problem where the home care people, like he was in the hospital with food. He was poisoned by the food they gave him. They gave him bad food. Another time, you know, he had several things that kept on happening to him. And he's like, I want self-directed care, meaning I want to receive the bundle of money that you would give the home care company, and I'll hire my own staff, because then at least I know that they will take care of me, because I am then the one hiring them. Now, we do have that program in Ontario, but they denied it to him. And I don't know why they denied it to him. It doesn't make any sense. But this is where he's at. He says, you know, I can't go home and have home care because I'll end up in the same boat as I always ended up in, where I'd have somebody who would show up to care for me and they end up sleeping on my couch. He says that I can't even get out of my bed. I'm not capable of doing so. I need self-directed care where I can hire my own staff who actually care about me and who take care of me. And so that's where that came from. You know, other issues have come up that are quite serious with all of this. You know, I mentioned Heather Hancock, but recently there was a case in Montreal that hit the media. So all these stories are stories that hit the media. You know, I didn't make any of them up. So you have this case of this woman who was born with cerebral palsy. So she's having a serious problem with the care she's receiving, and she's being pressured, this is in Montreal now, she's being pressured by the medical staff to ask for euthanasia. And she's like, yeah, you know, with my health condition, you're right, I do have pain. She says, but I can handle the pain. I can't handle being told that I should be dead. That's hard on me. That I can't handle when they're coming to me and saying, why haven't you asked for euthanasia? Why haven't you asked for what they call it MAID? Why haven't you asked for this? And she's like, I don't want to die. You know, and this is the whole thing. The pressure that's then built upon people once you legalize this. And you'd say, well, we wouldn't do that in Ireland. Well, they said in Canada we wouldn't do that. You know, I keep telling people, well, you know, if you go back to the news stories in 2015 and 16, even if you go to a lot of the debates in our parliament, you know, you hear the justice minister saying, well, you know, there are some problems in other jurisdictions that have legalized this, but we're not going to be like that in Canada. We're actually worse.
And on the, I suppose, proponents of euthanasia would say, like, just to bring it back to the point that it's something that's done from a place of compassion to end suffering. Right. Do you think that there's ever a legitimacy to that argument?
Okay, so they use the cases which are actually not common, but the ones that move us all, because we're all moved by someone who's suffering. So they're going to use the case of someone who's terminally ill and suffering, and they're going to promote that very heavy. And of course, that should emotionally affect us because we're human beings, right? We have an emotional capacity to care. But at the same time, the greater question is not whether we should be killing these people, it's, well, why are they suffering and what did we not do to care for them? Because we can provide proper care for people in all those circumstances. But now to kill them becomes a whole other story. Even then, with these difficult cases, you would say, okay, I don't want to live in this situation is what they're arguing. And my point is, well, you live in a society. You can't have a situation where you're going to give the doctor the right in law to kill you, because that's what we did in Canada. That's what they did in the Netherlands. That's what they did in Belgium. And that's what you're going to have to do in Ireland. If you look at how you have to legalize this, the only way to legalize this is to create an exception in your criminal law. Because you're not going to allow homicide to be legal, so you have to create an exception to homicide in your criminal law. That's what they did in the Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, Luxembourg. That's how we did it. So if you look at that, you're actually saying doctors, and in Canada, nurse practitioners, can have the free legal right to kill you.
And you said you've been doing this advocacy for 25 years now.
Yeah.
Where do you see this going? Do you think this is going to progress, or do you think that perhaps, you're seeing what the kind of cases we've discussed that perhaps it might be rolled back on?
Well, the issue of rolling back is difficult because that's an individual country sort of situation. And we do see a change, a culture shift going on in my country based on a lot of these stories that have come out. And people are saying, oh, well, that's not good and that's not good. So I would believe that if, and I actually am quite sure that if we had a different government in our country, in Canada, there would be some shift in the law. Nonetheless, I do have great hope for many reasons. One of the reasons is I've been involved very heavily also in the US politics on this question. In 2024, this year, there were 25 bills. So in the US, there's 10 states that have legalized assisted suicide. This year, there were 25 different states that had a bill to legalize assisted suicide. None of them have passed. In fact, in the last 3 years, no new state has legalized assisted suicide. And the assisted suicide lobby has put a huge amount of money into quite a few states to have a campaign that they thought they would win. And it always, in the end, gets stopped. So this concept that there's this tidal wave coming at us and we can't, avoid the legalization has been proven that that's not the case. When you actually talk about the issue, and this is the problem, if you don't, if the issue is sort of controlled by a sort of like a government type of oligarchy that wants this really bad, they can sort of keep down the information enough that people will say, well, I don't want to suffer, so maybe that's a good idea, because none of us want to suffer, right? But if you actually get into a true debate on the question, and you actually get into the real issues on the question, people who are elected start saying, well, this actually isn't a good idea, And if you start looking at what's happened in other jurisdictions, well, I know Canada has gone absolutely insane on this question. But we're not the only country that's went insane on this question. Look at Belgium, look at the Netherlands. Look at Switzerland with the recent death with Philip Nitschke's Sarco, his suicide pod. If you think about what they're actually doing there, it's actually quite insane if you start thinking about this. And I'm using the word insanity on purpose because outside of this issue, you would say, that doesn't make sense. How could you do that? But within the issue, people will say, oh, well, it's compassionate. They're using nitrogen gas. You just start Googling nitrogen gas deaths and start realizing what he's actually doing. And you start realizing that would never be accepted. That would, you would bring doctors to a Nuremberg trial over that kind of thing. And yet everyone's saying, oh, well, that was compassionate. That was their choice. No, you killed someone, actually. Start thinking it through. So we had a case in British Columbia last year that came out of a woman who had cancer, and she was denied cancer treatment in British Columbia, but she was offered euthanasia. So she was told that the type of cancer you have, the odds of you getting better are quite low. Therefore, we're not offering you treatment, but we will offer you euthanasia. Now, the woman wasn't interested in euthanasia, so her oncologist told her, well, go home, plan your funeral and everything else because we're not providing you treatment. This is in British Columbia, which is a pretty high-end place in Canada, okay? So anyway, what happened is she ended up going to the US for treatment. She ended up going to Baltimore. She went into full remission, so the treatment was fully successful. And so you see in the newspaper, she's actually petitioning the British Columbia government to pay for her cancer treatment because they didn't offer her cancer treatment. They did offer her euthanasia. They didn't offer her cancer treatment. So she wants the BC government to pay for her cancer treatment. And in the article, you see a picture of her at her wedding that she had in Hawaii, because after she went into recover, she decided to marry her boyfriend. So anyway, the interesting story is, once that hit the media, well, all these other stories popped up, because healthcare has become a serious problem. We have a serious problem with healthcare. I'm not saying, I don't know exactly how things are in Ireland, but you get other stories popping up. There's then an elderly woman who it took her 10 weeks before she could see her oncologist. So she ended up dying by euthanasia because the oncologist said to her, well, you know, I wish I'd seen you earlier. You have a treatable form of cancer, but it's actually spread quite far now. And with your advanced age, you know, we probably shouldn't do anything about this, you know, because the odds are very low for you, right?
You mentioned waiting lists. In Ireland, we have about 1 million people on waiting lists, a population of just over 5 million. So
when you're waiting for the treatment that could actually help you get better, and you don't receive that treatment, so in the end, you die by euthanasia. So in this case, the woman died by euthanasia. But then you had another case of a man who actually did see his oncologist. He was fully told that, yes, we will start treatment for you, but you have to wait in the queue. We have a lineup of treatment. We only have so much treatment available. And he waited for, you know, about 2.5 months for his treatment. And by the end of the 2.5 months, his cancer had spread to the point where they said, you know, it's really spread your cancer. It's very difficult. And he was going through a fair amount of suffering at this point, so he chose to die by euthanasia. So here you get the situation where this man's widow is saying to the newspapers after the other case came out of the woman who went to Baltimore, well, that wouldn't have been a choice for us. We don't have enough money to have gone to the US for treatment. We couldn't have done that. It wasn't even possible for us. My husband dies by euthanasia. Didn't even have a chance to get treatment, and we couldn't have afforded to go to the US for treatment. And so then they say, oh, this is all about freedom of choice and autonomy. You've got a news programs interviewing a widow who's in legitimate tears because they didn't have a choice, right? This is the kind of thing you're getting. You start putting these whole things together. I like to say to people, I say, well, you know, what has my country actually done to fix the healthcare system? You know, because it's a serious problem. You get these serious backlogs going on. And what have we actually done to fix the healthcare system? Well, they'll throw a little bit of money here and they'll throw a little bit of money there. They're hoping to, reduce the problem here and there a little bit. But they actually haven't solved it at all. It continues to get worse. But they've given us euthanasia. Start thinking about it. They've given us euthanasia. So yeah, if you die, you're right, you're not going to need treatment. Dead people don't need treatment,